Our final speaker in this session is Dr. Lubin-Levy. He's a doctoral candidate in the Department of Performance Studies at New York University. His dissertation, entitled Uncollectible Jack Smith and Performing the Hatred of Capitalism, is the first project of its kind to engage with the official archive of the artist, performer and filmmaker Jack Smith, held at Gladstone Gallery in New York. In addition to his doctoral work, he's also a practicing dramaturg and curator. Josh's paper is entitled All This Stuff, Jack Smith's Queer Materialism.
Thank you, Elaine and Alex and Cortal and Tara. And I think that bio is slightly misleading and written maybe perhaps too late at night because I'm engaging with the Gladstone's archive, whereas Dominic Johnson's fantastic book, which covers Jack Smith, is highly influential for my dissertation, and I want to make sure to note that. But this paper that I'm doing today is my attempt to think through a body of work left by queer artist and filmmaker Jack Smith as pointing towards a kind of materialist philosophy, often remembered as the subversively erotic mastermind behind the 1963 film Flaming Creatures. Smith's trenchant and nuanced critique of capitalist relations has been less well attended. The questions I've asked myself while writing include, if queer theory and queer art have so often been thought in relation to discourse, performativity, and identity, what might a queer materialism look like? And given that much of the history of queer art, like the history of queerness in general, remains by way of ephemera, gossip, hearsay, and suggestion, how could materialism enhance our reading of these traces of the queer lives, art, and spaces that even today continue to be not only undervalued, but subject to violent erasure? I've asked myself these questions while revisiting perhaps the most prominent material used by Smith in creating his works, namely the trash. Trash collected from city garbage cans as a daily practice, trash pillaged from abandoned industrial sites, trash made from Smith's dismantling and destroying his own body of work. All this trash accumulated, hoarded even, in Smith's home. Attending a performance at Smith's live-work loft, Stefan Brecht described the trash-filled setting as such, quote, "The heap glitters melodiously. The material is with puritanical strictness, in demonic purity junk, in substance, shape, and momentarily of absolutely no value. And it is from within this indecipherable mass of discarded matter that I hope to discover something about queerness and about materialism by way of Jack Smith." My paper proceeds in two parts, trash and materialism, and in the end, Smith's materialism will turn out to be part of a larger current running beneath attempts to not only think, but to change the world, a notion I derived from the late work of the author Serre. Taking up the destruction wrought by capitalism, the waste of consumer society, and the drive toward development and expansion, Smith uncovers the possibilities for a different, discarded origin of queer world-making. Part 1, Trash. I'll start with a story. It comes from Augusto Machado, featured here at a recent event. Augusto is an icon of queer performance, having worked with such figures as the Cockettes, Charles Ludlam, Jack Smith, among many others. This is Augusto Machado, or more specifically an image of Augusto Machado, a figure who, like so many, is often called on to represent a generation of queers and queer creativity that has been overly romanticized and reviled, displaced from our contemporary moment. Augusto was friends with Smith, and I want to start with the story of their first encounter in New York City in the 1970s. Story is maybe the wrong word, but I have to say it's more like an anecdote or a quip. A kind of half-true bit of gossip that has nonetheless stuck to my thinking. Such fragments are precisely what constitute the archive of queerness. Here it is. Recently, I asked Augusto how he met Smith, and he said that they met one night. I was crawling into the dumpster, Augusto said, and Jack was crawling out. At first, Augusto's story tells us nothing we didn't already know. Trashing, the practice of culling raw materials for both life and work from the trash heaps of New York City was a mode of survival for a number of underground filmmakers, performers, and artists who took an interest in this abundant and freely available material. Given the number of artists who have used trash in the creation of their work, it would be fair to say that any number of encounters could have been possible at the dumpster. At the same time, the dumpster or dump has a particular resonance in the context of Smith's work. Smith often envisioned reorganizing the city around a giant junkyard of unwanted and discarded items that would provide a site of exchange in which anyone could take or leave whatever they wanted or didn't need. There is resonance here with Walter Benjamin's description of the angel of history, who sees the past, rather than a chain of events, as one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage, end quote. Himself a noted collector of cultural detritus, Benjamin's work evinces a particular attunement to the life of things in their loss of fetishism, in their return to a material sensuousness outside a set of socially determined values. By locating their meeting around the dumpster, Machado seems to be pointing precisely to a kind of sensuous turn to trash as the center of a different social and economic order, one that perhaps already existed between the underground artists themselves, while at the same time gesturing towards a space where the social and symbolic meaning placed upon things begins to fall away. Machado means the literal dumpster as a site of coming together, but he also means the trashy culture, trashy venues, and experience of being considered the trash of society that brought him and Smith together. Along these lines, the abundance of trash in queer cultural production has often been read allegorically, as standing in for the discarded and marginalized lives of queer subjects. Such readings are deployed in the context of calling for a reevaluation of both the trashed and the trashy. Yet Smith's work hardly allows for such an uncomplicated celebration and reimagining of these destroyed and discarded items. We see in the thousands of photographs Smith took of his trash that he presented his collection in what at first appears to be an indiscriminate heap, though in fact reveals itself to be a much more careful arrangement of disorder. A pile of beer cans and bottles appears to be nothing more than documentation of litter until we see a few stalks of green grass growing out of this mound of metallic earth. An old sink, covered in dust, holds back an array of Christmas tinsel until we see a single cornstalk featured against this ornate background. A package of Ritz crackers appears to be jammed into a mound of trash that crawls up Smith's apartment walls until we see a single strand of that same Christmas tinsel dangling in the foreground next to what appears to be the dried up leaves from the plant from the first image of the tin cans. If Smith's images are a reflection on consumer culture of the 1950s and 60s, these are hardly the neatly organized and delineated Brillo boxes and Campbell's soup cans we might find elsewhere. In photograph after photograph, items of trash are found in their disorderly accumulation as if they had been both placed and dropped there, falling into place as they become pyres of indecipherable matter. Difficult to decipher and harder even to understand, this resistance to any easy ordering, display, or reuse of the items points to Smith's materialist pursuit of the trash, striving to enter the world of the trash, rather than to recycle trash into the world at hand. After leaving a performance at Smith's live-work loft, Jonas Mekas even describes Smith as, quote, the keeper of the graveyard at the end of civilization. There is certainly an association here between trash and queerness in Smith's work, but one that operates to keep the trash in its place rather than to recuperate or reclaim this unwanted material. How, Smith asks in a series of photographs staged in a stark, white room, an exception to the more cluttered and colorful settings in which he regularly worked. How can a queer escape the mocking laughter of the wealthy normal if they visit his very rejection sewer home to get art? Here again, we get the image of queerness coming together around a site of abjection. A sewer, much like a dumpster, is filled with waste, present in the form of a thought bubble, This photograph stands apart from the others I've shown as staging the act of thinking, even going so far, I would suggest, as to present Smith in a parody of a prison cell-like studio, complete with an ornate magnifying glass and the word "why" written in large red letters on the wall. How, Smith's question seems to ask, does the categorization of artwork to recuperate or work to recuperate or salvage something from the very abject condition of queer existence, particularly as it was lived by Smith from the 50s through the 80s in New York? And how, in this very salvation, does this revaluation of waste repurpose these works away from, and even in mocking response to, the very rejection sewer worlds that have often given shelter to queer life? Keeping the trash trashy has, in that sense, not only been an aesthetic choice, but a struggle for survival. Trash, as Smith said, is a material of creators. It exists whether one approves or not. There is something unique about Smith's pursuit of trash, not merely as it is repurposed in these artworks, but towards the world of materiality and the outside of value that exists whether one approves or not. Smith's practice reveals what Jose Munoz has described as distinctly, quote, materialist aesthetic philosophy, end quote. One driven to perform what the detritus of the commodity world with the detritus of the commodity world in order to, quote, disidentify with that world and perform a new one, end quote. Wary of the impulse to consider Smith's collection of trash as merely the inverse of social acceptability and social norms, Munoz reads Smith's trash as a particularly poignant medium for imagining, though not necessarily achieving, worlds outside the grip of a capitalist social order. There, on the edge of the city, in his home become dumping ground, Smith seems to have formed a certain collectivity with his trash, a longing for what he describes as, quote, the imperfect and ugly, very rich material to work with, especially the artifacts of the recent past. I'm an antiquarian anyway. I like artifacts, moldy things, end quote. Part 2, materialism. I should perhaps go back and note that the images I've shown you come from a collection of negatives in Smith's archive titled Erotic Garbage. Photography played a central role in Smith's practice. Let's see if I can start this. Photography played a central role in Smith's practice. Not only are photographs the most readily available record of many of Smith's live performances, but Smith would often pull from his expansive and ever-growing collection of images in developing slideshows, either as part of larger performance works or as performative works in themselves. Though these images are now neatly arranged in final forms at the Gladstone Gallery, Smith, as we see here, was much more apt. Oh no, it's stalling. That's okay, you get the point. Smith was much more apt to rearrange and reassemble these images regardless of their content, theme, chronology, and so forth. Smith was certainly not alone in turning to the slideshow as a formal artistic strategy. In the 60s and beyond, as the art object became increasingly more complex, material, ungraspable in itself, photographic documentation and the presentation of work through slideshows became a primary means of expanding this form and content of contemporary art. Somewhere between a photograph and film, slideshows became a way of thinking the totality of the work of art without producing a unified image. In Erotic Garbage, Smith seemingly defies this kind of retrospective gaze, offering instead a slideshow that is still in the making for a series of images that is still being accumulated in the exposition of a work that can only be classified as the garbage itself. Rather than a totality, Smith's slideshow presents the challenge of thinking that which lies beyond the possibility of a whole and unified image or interpretation. Yet the challenge and failure of thinking this unthinkable whole is precisely the challenge that Smith sets for us. Here we might register a resonance with a materialist turn in contemporary theory, particularly one that regularly cites the need to return to material conditions. The material conditions are a seemingly unimaginable global condition of political, economic, and ecological crisis. Eugene Thacker, for instance, begins his book on the matter thus, quote, "The world is increasingly unimaginable. In spite of our daily concerns, wants, and desires, it is increasingly difficult to comprehend the world in which we live and of which we are a part. Though never explicitly stated, Smith's work clearly evinces a rather prescient interest in this sort of materialism, and I would suggest a Marxist one at that. Rumor has it that Smith's favorite book was Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto. The closest we may come to understanding Smith's materialism is a manifesto-like statement made by the artist in the late 1970s in a diatribe against the institutionalization and increased hermeticism of the art world. Smith writes, "Ever since the desert glitter drifted over the burnt-out ruins of Plastic Lagoon, thousands of artists have not pondered and dreamed of such things. Yet art must not be used anymore as another elaborate means of fleeing from thinking because of the multiplying amounts of information each person needs to process in order to come to any kind of decision about what kind of world one wants to live in, since it has become obvious that the schools operate by picking everything out of context. Let art continue to be entertaining, escapist, stunning, naturalistic, and glamorous, but let it also be loaded with information worked into the vapid plots of movies, for instance." He goes on with a list of concrete examples, and we again see the idea of a city organized around, quote, a free paradise of abandoned objects. He then concludes with the rather sweeping statement, quote, "But the stairway to socialism is blocked by the Yvonne de Carlos Tabernacle Choir waving bloody palm branches and waiting to sing the Hymn to the Sun by Irving Berlin. This is the rented moment of exotic landlordism of Crab Lagoon." Proposing a space where fantasy and reality form a kind of paradoxical unity, Smith imagines a new infrastructure for the dilapidated city, one fully integrated with the superficial plots of movies. Indeed, there's a kind of dialectical urgency to Smith's vision, one that is both entertaining, escapist, stunning, naturalistic, glamorous, but that also calls on the viewer to make a decision based on multiplying amounts of information about the kind of world we should live in. Image after image from erotic garbage reinforces this mandate, both conceptually and aesthetically. Here, a pile of trash topped with a Minute Maid can that also recedes into the picture plane, the blurry background appearing almost like a landscape of jewels rolling into the distance, the closely cropped image refusing any sort of contextualization within a larger frame. Here, a series of stacked cans with the word "steel" sandwiched in the middle, presented backwards and against the background of a flattened scene of courtship. The trash seems to almost roll out of the two-dimensional background, arrested again by the parallel flatness of Smith's own photograph. And here, an array of red sparked by the presence of a gold-yellow fish swimming in a pool of Pepsi cans. An image that in its nearly monochromatic flatness hides a massive amount of material, something one can only see in taking time to study and acclimate to the image and its world. But more than proposing a challenge for thought or vision, these images also imagine and present a rather concrete utopia. Borrowing from Marx's famous thesis on Feuerbach, we may even say that for Smith, art should not simply contemplate the world, but should endeavor to change it, to arrange it into a state of perfect disorder. Something we might see in these superimposed images from erotic garbage, collages that could as easily be intended as they could in the context of a slideshow, be read as an error in which the slides jam up the slide projector itself. If Marx's thesis calls on the philosopher to change the world rather than simply contemplate it, he shares with Smith a certain urgency towards a kind of relational materialism, one that not only departs from the concrete conditions of our everyday lives, but works upon and seeks to alter our material existence. I would suggest that Smith even goes a step further, giving us destruction to be thought not simply as the aftermath of the desolation of an existing world, but as the very condition of a specific kind of queer world making. Marx's famous proposition was that revolution destroys a set social order only after its full development, but Smith subtly inverts this model, suggesting that destruction is the very foundation on which worlds occur. A similar strain of thought animates what in his later writing Louis Althusser describes as the underground current of materialism of the encounter, which he relates as both crucial to and yet in part repressed by Marx's larger analysis of material. In an essay by the same name, Althusser charts a line of thought through several disparate thinkers in order to illuminate the notion of the encounter of material entities coming together into beings of philosophical worlds. The famous example Althusser offers is Epicurus' notion of the swerve, that the world emerges from a void in which atoms fall parallel like raindrops, until one atom swerves into another, causing a pileup of atoms that congeals into a something out of a nothing. Described by Althusser as aleatory materialism, the productive possibility of the swerve, its capacity to catalyze a world, is contingent both on this encounter as well as on the predisposition of these atoms to get hooked on one another. Here, in other words, we have a theory of how things come together precisely by way of collision. And we also have a way of thinking the world, the great philosophical question of picturing the world, as predicated not on some sort of originary unity and wholeness, but rather on the condition of dispersion and disorder. The materialism of the encounter is contained, Althusser writes, in the welling up of order from the very heart of disorder to produce a world, end quote. A world we might know, not the world. It only takes the slightest swerve for other worlds to take hold. Order from the heart of disorder that creates a world. I can hardly find a better way to describe Smith's slideshows, a contingent and fleeting arrangement made from images of Smith's encounter with the trash, gesturing towards something just out of reach. Thank you.